Hey there, interwebs, and welcome back to How Fascinating. In one of my channel's other regular series, Russell's Guide to Monsters, we frequently look at chimeral creatures such as griffins, seahorses, and, chimeras. More of those next month. And previously on this series, we looked at real-life animal hybrids like coy wolves and growler bears, which are what you get when an animal of one species gets its chocolate and another species' peanut butter. And then they have sex. Today, however, we'll be examining another kind of combination creature, composite organisms. Put simply, these are organisms which are a composite of two or more independent organisms, and they generally live together in a mutually beneficial symbiotic relationship. Lichens are probably the most well-known examples of such entities, but considerably less well-known is the fact that most lichens are actually three organisms living together. Scientists have known for some time now that they're composed of fungi and algae or cyanobacteria, but it was only discovered relatively recently that the third partner in this mycological menage a trois is a kind of yeast. Lycanology is an incredibly fascinating topic on its own that I should probably do a separate video on, but the entire reason I bring it up now is to highlight the fact that lichen may be the only kind of composite organism. Or maybe not. The biggest issue with finding examples of composite organisms, or comporgs, is that it's not really a scientific term. Because of this, it's only loosely defined, so whether or not something qualifies as one can vary depending on whom you ask. For today, let's consider some debatable examples and see where that gets us, then establish a definition. So, what other comporgs are there? The one which springs immediately to mind is the spotted salamander, or, as I call it, the solar spotted salamander. I gave it this name because it is the only vertebrate of which I'm aware that performs photosynthesis. Sort of. The fascinating feat is actually accomplished during the embryonic phase of its development, as spotted salamander embryos have been found with the symbiotic algae Eusociality amblystomatus living inside of them. You see, their eggs are enveloped in a gelatinous coating which prevents them from drying out, but also inhibits the diffusion of oxygen required for embryo development. Fortunately for all parties involved, the symbiotic algae performs photosynthesis, creating oxygen within the jelly which the developing amphibian then metabolizes. This in turn generates carbon dioxide which is consumed by the algae, in a dance as old as time. Not only is this a perfect example of mutualism in action, it also marks the only known example of a vertebrate hosting non-mitochondrial endosymbiont microbes. Thus, I'd argue that spotted salamanders qualify as comporgs, at least during their embryonic phase. Other photosynthetic vertebrates include sloths, manatees, and certain kinds of testudines such as Mary River turtles. All of these creatures live in warm, wet, sunny environments and move so slowly that algae can grow on their exterior. The algae gets a place to live, and in exchange the animals get some free bonus camouflage. What sets spotted salamanders apart from the rest of these animals is the exact location of their greenery. With their algae-adorned amniotes, the algae is merely on them, but in the case of the salamanders, it's in them. Epp-Leppel lives inside the developing cells. Another genus of intracellular photosynthetic symbionts is the aptly named Symbiodinium, and I dare you to say that 3 times fast. These dinoflagellates are unicellular microalgae which commonly reside in the endoderm of tropical cnidarians such as corals, jellyfish, and sea anemones, which are really just unmotivated jellyfish doing a headstand. They can also be found in certain flatworms, sponges, and giant clams, better known as tridacna, although in the latter case they exist as intercellular entities between the cells rather than inside them. Oh yeah, fun fact, giant clams are solar-powered. Due to being sessile filter feeders in relatively nutrient-poor or oligotrophic waters, adult tridacna clams get 70% or more of their total nutrients from the photosynthetic algae living within the soft tissue of their mantle. Speaking of shellfish, let's shift our attention now to hermit crabs. These adorable anemones are possibly another group of comporgs, albeit one which I only managed to think of after racking my brain for quite some considerable time. This is what a naked hermit crab looks like on its own, but you probably imagine them with shells. This is because they've evolved to live in the shells of other creatures and don't live very long in the wild outside of them, but the shells themselves are not part of the crabs. They're commonly the exoskeletons of marine snails. Basically, hermit crabs walk around wearing the skeletons of other animals. Metal. Also, we've established twice already that shellfish don't exist, at least not as a scientific classification, since the group includes both arthropods like lobsters and prawns and mollusks like clams and oysters. That being said, hermit crabs may be the most comprehensive form of shellfish, since they're crustaceans, i.e. arthropods, which also, usually, incorporate the shell of a snail, which is another kind of mollusk. Furthermore, they like to adorn their upcycled organic armor with sea anemones, but these serve a purpose beyond simple decoration. The anemones, with their stinging tendrils, act like venomous guard dogs posted outside the crab's mobile fortress. Again, metal. Plus, hermit crabs are messy eaters, so the anemones get free meals from the food scraps. Boxer crabs have a similar thing going on where they'll wear anemones on their claws like darling little pom-poms. and then punch the ever-loving shit out of stuff. Decorator crabs are named for their tendency to adorn their carapaces with sponges and other sedentary organisms to serve as camouflage or a deterrent to predators if the attached creatures are toxic. The hermit crab's anemones aren't just along for the ride, either. They're as much a part of the crab as the shell is. More so, in fact. When a hermit crab grows too large and must upgrade to a bigger shell, it brings its anemones with it, carefully peeling them off of the old and sticking them on to the new. So-called blanket hermit crabs of the genus Paguropsis and Paguropsina don't even bother with the shell. They wear their anemones, which they acquire at a larval stage and spend the rest of their lives with, directly on their carapace like a venomous hoodie. Between an arthropod providing mobility, a mollusk providing shelter, and cnidarians providing defense, one could certainly argue that hermit crabs are comporgs, even if the snail isn't technically alive by that point. Following the same principle, but on a much larger scale, you may have heard the fun factoid that the world's largest living organism is Australia's Great Barrier Reef. The parts of it which are still living, that is, but in this context I'm using the original definition of a factoid, something which is widely believed, but factually untrue. The Great Barrier Reef is not a single living creature. It's a whole bunch of them. This may, however, qualify it as a composite organism. To liken one to lichen, the structure of a coral reef is provided by the skeletons of stony corals, both living and dead, which are then inhabited by marine plants, algae, and sessile animals such as sponges and anemones, not to mention the many mobile denizens of the deep like fish. Although coral reefs are, strictly speaking, ecosystems and not organisms, this hasn't stopped people from misidentifying them as such. Remaining under the sea for the moment, mature, sexually active anglerfish are, as long-term viewers may remember, chimeral hermaphrodites. This is because the males of the species will latch on to a female's side, then fuse with her and wither away until they're nothing but a set of oddly located gonads. Although both are fascinating, a chimeral organism is not the same thing as a composite organism, since the male and female components are members of the same species. That being said, people didn't realize that was the case for quite a while, just like Chetomimidae, where males, females, and juveniles were until recently believed to belong to 3 distinct taxonomic families. Anglerfish may still qualify as comporgs in another way, however. The feature of anglerfish which is literally most prominent, and indeed which earned them their name, is the esca at the end of their elysium. That's the glowy dongle, but anglerfish aren't like fireflies. They can't make their own light. Instead, it comes from bioluminescent bacteria which live within the lure. Not many people know that, but wait, it gets weirder. The bacteria can't make the light on their own, either. Some of these bacterial species are incapable of luminescence independent of the anglerfish, lacking the necessary chemical components, which suggests that they've developed a symbiotic relationship wherein the fish are relied upon to make up the difference. Basically, the two come together to form something greater than the sum of its parts. Also in episode 37, we mentioned briefly the Portuguese man-o'-war. Despite their superficial resemblance to their cousins, jellyfish or sea jellies, man-o'-wars, yes, that is an acceptable plural, belong to a different group of medusae known as siphonophores. These hydrozoans are a type of colonial superorganism composed of a myriad of smaller individual entities known as zooids. Although all the zooids in any given siphonophore develop from the same fertilized egg and are therefore genetically identical, they perform specialized tasks, essentially functioning like organs in a shared body. For example, man-o'-war polyps can become a pneumatophore for buoyancy, gastrozooids which digest prey, or tentacular palpons armed with venomous nematocysts, or, to use the technical term, stingy thingies. Hydrozoa, however, are not the only colonial superorganisms on the scene. Certain insects such as ants, honeybees, and termites could also fit this definition. While a siphonophore may seem like a single entity, but is actually many physiologically connected creatures, these insect colonies may seem to be many individuals, but they're arguably a single unconnected superorganism. Just like how different zooids in the same man-o'-war fill different roles such as digesting or reproducing, the same goes for various ants in a colony. Each one may have a certain level of physical autonomy, but any individual ant is kind of screwed on its own. The queen is helpless without soldiers to defend the colony or workers to gather resources, but the workers and soldiers need the queen to continue producing the larvae which are essential to the colony's continued survival, both producing the next generation and feeding the current one. Yes, you heard that correctly. Although it depends on the species, some adult ants are incapable of consuming solid food. Instead, the larvae essentially act as the superorganism's communal stomach, eating the food and converting it into a nutritious sap-like fluid which is then distributed among the mature members of the colony. This type of communal existence is known as Eusociality, and it's defined by overlapping generations within a colony of adults, the division of labor into reproductive and non-reproductive groups, and cooperative brood care. While most examples of it come from the arthropod phylum, the behavior has also been observed in mammals. Naked mole rat colonies, for example, have a single reproductive female who gives birth to all of the infants, which are then collectively raised by the other members. Some have tried to argue that humans are also a eusocial species, but our reproduction is not performed by a dedicated breeding caste. Although eusociality is fascinating too, it also isn't the same thing as being a comporg. The thing about colonial organisms like siphonophores and eusocial species, which disqualifies them, in my opinion, is that although they are composed of multiple individuals, all of the component creatures are still members of the same species, just like chimeral anglerfish. There is one last potential comporg I want to mention before we wrap up this video, and it's one which I can guarantee you interact with on a daily basis. It's you. Lots of human beings like to think they're someone special, but they're wrong. They're a whole bunch of special creatures, or should I say specialized creatures. In addition to being composed of 50 to 100 trillion somatic cells, your body is also home to roughly the same number of symbiotic microorganisms, and just like how the different zooids of a siphonophore and the different ants of a colony cooperate by performing specialized tasks, so too do our microorganisms rely on each other, and we rely on them. If you've never heard the term before, the Human Microbiome is defined by the Encyclopedia Britannica as the full array of microorganisms that live on and in humans and, more specifically, the collection of microbial genomes that contribute to the broader genetic portrait, or metagenome, of a human. The digestive microbiota, or gut flora, alone are roughly 10 to 100 trillion of these little critters whose collective genome contains at least 100 times as many genes as the human genome itself. Like it or not, you're only a small part of your own genetic makeup. The rest of the big picture is provided by bacteria, archaea, fungi, protozoans, and non-living viruses. Really, you aren't 1 in a million. You're 1,000,000 in 1. To quote Britannica once more, the sheer microbial abundance suggests that the human body is in fact a supraorganism, a collection of human and microbial cells and genes, and thus a blend of human and microbial traits. So I guess you and I are superorganisms, but are we composite organisms too? To answer that question, we'll have to return to where we started, establishing our definition. Before I do that, however, I want to define a different phrase, obligate mutualism. This is a type of symbiotic mutualism in which the species involved are so interdependent that one cannot survive without the other. Say, for example, humans and our friendly neighborhood gut flora. A composite organism, in my book, is any case of interspecies obligate mutualism where the constituent species are physiologically connected, forming a single corporeal entity. This means that leafcutter ants and the Atomyces fungi would not be an example, because although the species rely on each other for survival, they are not physically connected, and siphonophores, although connected, are not comporgs either, because the component zooids are all members of a single species. Hermit crabs and sea anemones are two different species sharing a body, but each can survive without the other, fortunately for them, but unfortunately for us in our search for composite organisms. This definition doesn't exclude everything, though. It still includes lichen, anglerfish, spotted salamanders, giant clams, and, perhaps most notably, humans. Let no one ever say you're not a team player. As always, I'd like to thank you and your resident microorganisms for watching, and I hope you all have a fascinating day.